So in this section, we're going to talk about the different illnesses that can happen when we move to altitude. Acute mountain sickness is one of the most common illnesses that appears at, at after exposure to altitude. The onset is 6 to 48 hours after arrival, with the most severe symptoms occurring 2 to 3 days after exposure starts. The symptoms include headache, nausea and vomiting, dyspnea, and insomnia. In a different section, we talked about dyspnea. In layman's terms, we describe this as inability to catch your breath. But physiologically, we know dyspnea results because there's a mismatch between the body's ability to regulate the partial pressures of O2 and CO2 against ventilation. So that dysregulation results in dyspnea. These symptoms can develop into more lethal conditions, and the frequency of AMS is more frequent with women versus men. So the incidence of AMS is higher in females versus males. The frequency of AMS increases with increasing altitude. So with an increase in altitude or the rate of ascent, the susceptibility of AMS increases. So the use of base camps to ascend slowly would reduce the risk of AMS. Possible causes of AMS include a low ventilatory response to altitude. We mentioned in the previous section that one of the first immediate responses to altitude is hyperventilation. So if a person has low ventilatory response, the CO2 will accumulate and result in acidosis, and this is one cause of AMS. Headache is the most common symptom experienced at altitude. So if you ever visited the top of Mauna Kea, which is 4,200 meters above sea level, you may have experienced headache, just a throbbing, a consistent throbbing in your head. And it's often worse in the morning and after exercise. And the pain that you feel in your head is due to the hypoxic conditions that you're in. So the hypoxic conditions stimulates the vasodilation of your vessels in your cerebrum, and this stimulates the stretch pain receptors, which you perceive as throbbing or pain. Another illness is the Cheyne-Stokes breathing, and this is basically an interruption of sleeping during ventilation due to hypoxia. So it's characterized by rapid breathing and then slow, shallow breathing with intermittent periods when breathing completely stops. So this is similar to sleep apnea. And the reason for this is because as we hyperventilate, we start to blow off too much CO2. And as a result, we become alkaline. And so this alkalinity is going to be detected by the chemoreceptors, and it's going to stimulate the brain respiratory control center to reduce the breathing rate so that CO2 can now build back up to normal levels. While ventilation is suppressed, O2 content decreases. And so it's a cycle of balancing O2 and CO2 partial pressures, which is causing the alternation of increased rapid breathing, slow, shallow breathing, and then periods where breathing completely stops. So this is one of the causes of insomnia, as we saw with acute mountain sickness, and it does not allow for very restful sleep, as you can imagine, at altitude. So acute mountain sickness, it develops 6 to 12 hours after ascent. It peaks 2 to 3 days after exposure, and it usually resolves itself within a week with acclimatization. So if the symptoms are not reversed with supplemental oxygen, descent obviously would be the proper treatment. AMS is also associated with fluid retention, which leads to increased intracranial pressure and lung swelling, which is going to impair the O2 and CO2 exchange. So although we talked about how at altitude, the low oxygen content in the blood is a result of the low barometric pressure, this is an instance where there's going to be other factors that are going to limit oxygen diffusion across the respiratory membrane. And in this case, it's edema of the lung. So the fluid retention is caused by the renal handling of the water, where it switches from a net loss to no change to a net water gain. And then the fluid will be moved into the intracellular space. So to prevent AMS, it's suggested that a gradual ascent to altitude is used, to have a supplemental oxygen available in hyperbaric rescue bags. And obviously, retreat to a lower altitude would be the most common and easiest treatment. The length of stay and the altitude reach, and also the speed at which the person ascends, is going to directly affect the presence of AMS and the severity of its symptoms. A diet rich in carbohydrates may reduce AMS symptoms by 30%. Mild exercise aids acclimatization. So if you are experiencing AMS, doing some sort of mild, low to moderate exercise, whether it be walking, this process aids acclimatization. Sleeping low and climbing high is another alternative, where you would climb high during the day and then come back down to a base camp to sleep at night. And this will help to reduce AMS symptoms. The age, gender, health status, and previous experience at altitude, and of course, genetic inheritance is going to play a factor in whether you display symptoms of AMS. So if you're going to ascend to altitude, you may want to have Diamox on hand. So acetazolamine is something that inhibits carbonic anhydrase. So carbonic anhydrase is an enzyme which catalyzes this reaction. So if we do not allow this reaction to move forward, then the production of CO2 is reduced, which reduces the amount of CO2 that's going to be blown off. So this Diamox will help to reduce pH levels by helping to retain the hydrogen ions within the body. Again, at altitude, the kidneys excrete bicarbonate. So the renal excretion of bicarbonate also helps to help retain CO2 within the body and helps to maintain pH levels. At altitude, there are two life-threatening conditions, one being high-altitude pulmonary edema and the other being high-altitude cerebral edema. And they can develop from severe altitude sickness. So these usually happen on a continuum. And the presence of HAPE or HACE means that treatment or retreat to a lower altitude should happen immediately. So high altitude pulmonary edema is likely related to pulmonary vasoconstriction due to hypoxia, as the body's trying to adapt to hypoxic conditions. It can also involve clot formation in the pulmonary circulation. And the symptoms are shortness of breath, coughing, tightness in the chest, fatigue. On the outside, the person's lips would be bluish in color, the fingernails would be bluish in color. The person will have confusion, and they also may be unconscious. So obviously, supplemental oxygen and immediate descent to lower altitude would be the appropriate measure to take. High altitude cerebral edema is a little bit more serious than the pulmonary edema, and this is due to the edemic pressure buildup in the intracranial space. So in both HAPE and HACE, confusion is a symptom. In both scenarios, confusion is a symptom. It also results in lethargy, so feeling fatigued, ataxia, unconsciousness, and even death. So in this case, supplemental oxygen and immediate descent to lower altitude would be appropriate. So this image is showing you high altitude cerebral edema, where the blood vessels are able to leak fluid into the intracranial space, increasing the amount of pressure around the brain, and this can lead to confusion, coma, and even death. So the difference between lowlanders and high altitude natives. So high altitude natives are those who live and reside at altitude. So between lowlanders and high altitude natives, they have the same exercise economy and similar body composition. What sets high altitude natives apart is that they are polycythemic, which means their hematocrit is greater than 60%, which means their oxygen carrying capacity is higher than lowlanders. The high altitude natives have larger heart dimensions, greater cardiac mass, larger lungs, more capillaries, and they have a larger chest in relation to their total body. So they have a larger lung capacity in relation to lowlanders. So the high altitude natives have about 65% hematocrit, and if you recall, the normal hematocrit is about 42 to 48 in females, 45 to 52% in males. So high altitude natives have significantly higher hematocrit levels. So the oxygen carrying capacity of the high altitude natives is 28% greater than sea level residents. So what's also really interesting is that the high altitude natives have more extensive coronary artery circulation, which is going to protect them from residing in hypoxic conditions. So this means that they have a greater capacity for oxygen diffusion across the lungs capillaries, and this helps to combat against the low partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, and it helps to diffuse more oxygen into the blood. And the greater the surface area, or the greater the capillarization, and the greater the surface area of contact between the pulmonary capillaries and the alveoli, this increases the amount of oxygen that can be diffused across that membrane, and that is in accordance with Fick's law of diffusion. So high altitude natives also have lower incidences of coronary artery disease, and when and during childhood, the maximum benefits of acclimatization due to the oxygen transport mechanisms during puberty and other critical periods of growth and development, so that during that childhood time, this is when the high altitude natives have the maximum benefits, or they achieve, or they receive the maximum benefits. So when lowlanders become residents at 4,000 meters, which is altitude, their cardiac output falls and remains suppressed for months. And this is a stressful event for lowlanders as they reside at altitude. So of course it's going to stimulate the HPA axis, which is one of our stress response axes. If you recall, the HPA axis is when the hypothalamus releases cortical releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary gland to stimulate ACTH, which then moves to act in an endocrine fashion on the adrenal cortex, which stimulates cortisol. So this increased cortisol level is seen in lowlanders as they move to high altitude, but the high altitude natives do not have increased cortisol levels, indicating that they're acclimatized to this environment, and living in the environment is not perceived as a stress. So if you're a lowlander and you move to high altitude, your cortisol levels will return to pre-exposure levels after 1 week of exposure. And this is the end of this section. In this section, we'll be looking at fat and protein consumption in its relation to exercise performance. Again, I'm going to go over slides with the star in the upper left-hand corner. Again, do not skip over slides that I do not spend a lot of time on, as they still contain important information, but the information is very straightforward. So I'm going to skip this slide and this slide. And we're going to head right into proteins here. So what's important about this slide is the RDAs, or the recommended dietary allowances, for these different demographics. What you will be responsible for knowing is the RDAs of children 4 to 13 years of age, children 14 to 18 years of age, and adults. And then later in this section, I'll show you the RDAs for the different types of athletes. You will be responsible for knowing those numbers as well. So I would like to point out that children 4 to 13 years of age have a higher RDA than children 14 to 18, because it makes sense. Children 4 to 13 are exhibiting the greatest trajectory of growth. And it's interesting to note that the children's RDA for protein consumption is higher than the average adult who is not exercising. And then I give an example of how to calculate this. Okay, so this is the other slide that's important, where strength athletes are recommended to consume 1.6 to 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, and endurance athletes 1.2 to 1.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. There is no evidence that shows that exceeding 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is beneficial, and in fact, it will or may have a detrimental effect to the kidney, which needs to secrete unused amino acids. And this can also contribute to dehydration. So the bottom line is that 10 to 15% of calories should come from protein. So these next slides, we're going to talk about vitamins. Please make sure to go through these slides, and I'm going to focus on the vitamins that have an impact on performance. So the B complex vitamins come from fish, meat sources. So if you're working with athletes who are vegan, they will need to supplement and get their B complex vitamins in a different manner. So vitamin B1 is thiamine, and this is needed for the conversion of pyruvic acid to acetyl-CoA, which is the first step in the Krebs cycle. Vitamin B2 is riboflavin, and this becomes FAD, which acts as a hydrogen acceptor during oxidation in the electron transport system, which is our aerobic system, which helps us to generate ATP. Vitamin B3 is niacin, and it's a component of NAD, that very, very important coenzyme in glycolysis. And vitamin B12 is needed for red blood cell production. So you can see if an athlete or a client is deficient in your B complex vitamins, this would result in fatigue, inability to produce energy or ATP, or inability to carry oxygen to the muscles on red blood cells. So athletes or clients who are vegan may use something called nutritional yeast. And if you have never tried nutritional yeast, I would encourage you to try it. And if you like tofu, I would encourage you to try and make tofu scramble with nutritional yeast. That was the first thing that I've tried to make, and I actually thought it was very, very delicious. So I leave that up to you to try nutritional yeast. Nutritional yeast is fairly tasty as well, so you can add it to your stir-fry dishes or whatever it may be. We're going to skip the vitamin C, and we're going to skip these next slides. And we're going to talk about iron. Iron is a micromineral, and it's required for the formation of hemoglobin and myoglobin. So it's very important in our oxygen carrying capacity. So if you have an athlete who is anemic, who has a low iron content, they're going to feel fatigued because their body is not going to be able to carry, or their blood cells, they won't have enough blood cells to carry oxygen to their skeletal muscles, and this would inhibit their performance. And this brings us to the end of this section. Again, please go back and review the slides that I did not spend a lot of time on. They are still important. It's just that the information on those slides were very straightforward. In this next section, we're going to examine water and hydration. Water is very important because it makes up our blood plasma, our blood volume, which transports and delivers nutrients to our tissues. So if we were to take all our total body water, we would be able to divide it into two compartments, one being our intracellular space, or the water contained within our cells, and 1/3 of the water would be contained in our extracellular space. This extracellular space is comprised of our blood within our vascular space, and then also fluid surrounding our cells, so our interstitial space. The intracellular space contains most of our total body water, with only 1/3 of our total body water being contained in our vasculature within our interstitial space. And this also includes our lymph. So we lose water, and the water that we lose through our respiration and skin that we do not sense is called insensible water loss. And then 60% of water is filtered out through our kidneys and we excrete it. 5% of our water loss is through sweating, and then 5% is through fecal loss through our large intestine. Our intake of water primarily comes from what we ingest. So 60% of water comes from the fluids we drink, and then 30% of water comes from the foods we eat, such as fruits or vegetables that contain a high content of water. And then 10% of the water is produced in our cells during metabolism. So at rest, most of the water that we intake, again, is through fluids. 30% of the water we intake is through foods. 10% of the water we have is going to be through metabolic production. At rest, we lose more water through our respiration and through our insensible water loss. During exercise, most of our water loss happens through sweating, and only 10% of our water loss comes from insensible water loss. So we're going to skip this slide because it just reiterates what we talked about in the previous slide. Now we're going to skip this slide because now we're going to talk about dehydration. So a body weight loss of 2% due to dehydration is enough to impair performance. So what this slide is showing is that somebody who's hydrated in blue versus a subject who is dehydrated in red. The hydrated subject is going to be able to maintain a higher running velocity compared to the dehydrated subject. How does dehydration affect performance? Well, one, if you're dehydrated, your plasma volume is reduced, so your heart rate would have to increase. Frank Starling's mechanism says this does not allow for greater filling, and so your cardiac output or stroke volume is going to be reduced. So you're going to have less cardiac output to support you during exercise. Also, if these subjects were running in a hot environment, the blood would be redirected to the skin in an effort to dissipate the heat. So now we have more competition of blood between the working muscles and the skin. So the hydrated individual would be better equipped to handle the redirection of blood to the skin and working muscles versus the dehydrated subject. So this slide is showing the effect of dehydration on heart rate. And this is directly related to plasma volume. So if we do not hydrate during exercise, our plasma volume drops, which will result in a reduced venous return. And as a result, heart rate would have to increase to compensate for the reduced stroke volume. So this is what this graph is showing, that replenishment with either water or IV saline will help to keep heart rate at a steady state level. But notice in both scenarios, cardiovascular drift has occurred where although the workload remained the same, in both the red and green scenarios with either water or saline, heart rate slowly drifted up over time, showing that there was additional dehydration and water loss. So what are the effects of dehydration? Obviously, we'll have a reduction of blood or plasma volume. This reduction in plasma volume would reduce venous return, and as a result, cardiac output and stroke volume would be reduced. To compensate for the reduction in stroke volume, heart rate would need to be increased. The onset of blood lactate or the ventilatory threshold or the anaerobic point would be reduced because with a reduction in plasma volume, now we have a reduction of oxygen delivery. So now we're going to shift our reliance more on the anaerobic metabolism because we're not supplying the aerobic metabolism with enough oxygen. So our ventilatory threshold would drop, which means the intensity at which we could perform exercise would be reduced. Muscle strength and muscle endurance may or may not change. Research has shown both scenarios where with dehydration, muscular strength was reduced, and then other studies showed that there was no change in muscular strength or endurance. On the other hand, run time to exhaustion and total work performed in an endurance event are reduced when the subject is dehydrated. So as far as sweat composition, we are going to be mostly concerned with our sodium and potassium loss. So we're going to skip through these slides here. And we talked about this before, where we know that by the time we're thirsty, we're already dehydrated. And the reason for this is because our osmoreceptors are detecting the osmolality of our plasma, and it's sending this signal to the hypothalamus. As a result, the hypothalamus is signaling, is giving signals of thirst. So the human thirst mechanism is a poor gauge, and it does not sense thirst until we're already dehydrated, until our plasma osmolality is already high. So again, plasma osmolality, when that's increased, it will stimulate thirst. A water loss of greater than 2 liters is going to stimulate thirst. Our renin-angiotensin system makes us feel thirsty, and our mouth and throat receptors are going to stimulate thirst as well. And stomach distension. So if we are drinking a lot of water, or perhaps we just ate a big meal, we might have that thirst sensation, but the fullness that we feel in our stomach may inhibit us from hydrating. So that stomach distension is going to also be a mechanism which regulates thirst, where the stretch of our stomach is going to be sensed, and this will give our CNS feedback and inhibit us from drinking. Hyponatremia is defined as low sodium content in the blood. So hypo meaning low, natremia referring to sodium. So hyponatremia can result when an athlete is performing endurance events in the heat and they're only replenishing with water and not replenishing with sodium and water. So as a result, they're losing fluid, but they're only replenishing with water that is going to reduce their plasma osmolality. And so that's what is being reflected on this side of the graph, is that when the concentration of sodium in our plasma becomes too reduced, it will result in changes in our physical function, and in severe cases, it could lead to coma. Hyponatremia is rare. It takes a lot of willpower and motivation on these athlete or subjects' part to reach a state of hyponatremia. And usually we hear these cases of hyponatremia on in competitions of who can drink the most water. And the last I heard was a radio station that promoted this water drinking competition, resulting in hyponatremia and death of the contestant. And this is the end of our water section. Welcome to nutrition. So in this section, we're going to cover nutrition as it relates to exercise performance. So similar to the other section, I am not going to go over every single slide. However, please do review the material, as the slides that I am skipping over, the material presented on those slides are pretty straightforward. So for example, I will be going over slides with this blue star in the upper left-hand corner. The main concept in this section will be carbo loading and carbohydrate utilization during exercise. So we know that carbohydrates are the main source or the body's preferred fuel for energy and energy production. Not only is it the body's preferred source, it is the only source of energy that can be used for high intensity exercise lasting greater than 60 seconds. And this is our glycolytic system. And also glucose is the only energy or the only substrate that the nervous system can rely on. So a high carbohydrate diet will allow the complete recovery of muscle glycogen levels between 2-hour work bouts. And what this graph is showing is that in subjects who ingested a high carbohydrate diet between these work bouts, they're able to maintain their muscle glycogen levels versus individuals who did not consume high carbohydrate diets. Over progressive exercises, their muscle glycogen levels started to decrease over time, so that a high carbohydrate diet would maximize carbohydrate storage within the muscle, and in the muscle it's stored as muscle glycogen. Glycogen is used as quickly as the usage of glycogen is going to be used as a function of the intensity of the exercise. So for example, if we're working at 31% of our max, muscle glycogen will last for 180 minutes. Versus if we're working at a super maximal intensity at 120 or 150% of our max, our glycogen in our muscle will be depleted within 30 minutes. And the reason for this, if you recall, is in these lower intensity exercises, we are relying on fat metabolism. So the reliance on glucose when we're working at 31 or 64% of our max is going to be much lower. And this is going to allow us to use glycogen at a slower rate. So eccentric exercise also impairs muscle glycogen resynthesis. So after performing eccentric exercise or negatives, the amount of glucose that can be stored within that muscle is going to be reduced. And there's some evidence that suggests that this eccentrically exercised muscle is less sensitive to insulin, which would also limit its uptake of glucose. So just keep this in mind if you're trying to replenish your glycogen storage. Your glycogen storage is going to be inhibited after a really tough eccentric exercise regimen. Most athletes should consume 50% of their diet. From athletes, 50% of the diet should be comprised of carbohydrates. For endurance athletes, the contribution of carbohydrates in their diet should be a little bit higher. And in this case, I've written 55 to 65%. So depending on the intensity of the exercise will determine the energy contribution or the amount of carbohydrates that the athlete should ingest. As in the previous slide where I showed that very high intensity exercise would result in quicker carbohydrate depletion, this is showing that the higher the intensity of the exercise, the greater the intake of carbohydrates should be. So this slide is just giving you an example of what 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight would look like. So again, you would multiply 8 to 12 grams if you are an athlete who is performing at extremely high intensities, and multiply it by your body weight in kilograms. And this would give you an absolute amount of carbohydrates that you must ingest per day. And I've given examples of types of foods and the amount of carbohydrates within each food. So not only is the total amount of carbohydrate important, but what's also important is the quality of carbohydrates, or the glycemic index. Glycemic index is an arbitrarily assigned number, and it's going to be scored relative to the glucose response to 50 grams of sugar, of table sugar. So the GI index is equal to the blood glucose response over 2 hours to a test food in relation to the response of blood glucose to glucose itself. So a high GI food or high glycemic food is anything with a GI of greater than 70. And this includes sports drinks, jelly beans, baked potato, I'll bet without the skin, French fries, which are the inside part of the potato, and popcorn and cornflakes. The moderately GI rated foods are foods that have a GI of 56 to 70, and this includes bread, white rice, bananas, and ice cream. Ice cream has a lower GI than sports drinks because it has a higher fat content that would help to reduce the GI. Low GI foods are categorized as GIs less than or equal to 55, and this includes beans, milk, M&Ms, presumably with nuts or peanuts, because if you add or consume foods of a high GI nature with foods of a low GI nature, the collective response would be a reduced GI. So if you're going to consume carbohydrates right before exercise, you want to consume food with a low GI. So essentially, you don't want to have your body start to store the glucose because you've eaten a high GI food. So you're going to start exercise with low blood sugars. When you want to consume carbohydrates during exercise, these should be of high GI nature. So for example, the GIs for these different food groups are listed on this table. So for example, peanuts has a pretty low GI rated less than 55, indicating it's a low GI food. Baked potato is a high GI food listed at 85, which is greater than 70, which is the cutoff point for a high GI food. So high GI food should not be ingested 15 to 45 minutes before exercise. And the reason being that if you ingest a high GI food, glucose levels in your blood will go up. As a response, insulin would be secreted, and this insulin will start to store your glucose, and your blood glucose levels will drop. The reason why insulin is released is because you have not started exercise yet. Remember, we said that during exercise, insulin is going to be inhibitive. If you were to exercise and ingest a high GI food, insulin would be inhibited, so you would not have this drop in blood glucose. So again, if you're eating prior to exercise, 15 to 45 minutes prior to exercise, the carbohydrate of choice should be a low GI source. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. I'm going to skip this slide. And I'm going to skip this slide. Okay, so the bottom line is that pre-exercise, consuming a low GI food is going to prevent the insulin response and the dropping of blood glucose. As a result, you would start your exercise with reduced blood glucose, which is not ideal. If you are exercising and you need to replenish your carbohydrates or fuel, a high GI food would be a good alternative. So this would include sports drinks, those gel packets. Anything with a high GI content will help support your carbohydrate fuel source during exercise. And then post-exercise, eating a high GI food will help to maintain blood glucose levels and help glycogen replenishment. So although we're talking about aerobic type exercise or anaerobic type exercise, where we're talking about an endurance type activity, we are also able to deplete our muscle glycogen with weight training. So in this one study, they showed that a single set of bicep curls or elbow flexion at 80% of 1 RM up until muscular failure caused a 12% reduction in glycogen concentration. So note that they went to muscular failure, indicating that volitional fatigue was reached, indicating that the lack of fuel may have been the cause of fatigue. Other studies also reported similar findings where muscular contractions of the vastus lateralis led to a 38% decrease in glycogen. So therefore, although you may not be performing an endurance-like activity, if you are performing a weight training regimen where you take your muscles to volitional fatigue, your glycogen supply or storage within that muscle will be depleted, and therefore glycogen resynthesis and restorage would be necessary. So if you know that you are going to participate in some event such as a marathon or an event where repeated muscular contractions until fatigue is going to occur, you might benefit from glycogen loading, and this is also called carbohydrate loading. And the idea behind carbohydrate loading is that you ingest a lot of carbohydrates, so you pack your liver and your muscle with the maximum amount of glycogen that it can store, and that way you'll have the substrates ready for use during exercise. The general rule of thumb is that if the activity is going to last greater than 60 seconds, you may benefit from glycogen or carbo loading. So the classic carbo loading protocol is A-strands glycogen loading, where it requires depletion of glycogen in the first stage. So over the first few days, well, on the first day, you're going to perform exhaustive exercise to deplete your muscle glycogen in the particular muscle you're looking to maximize. So if you're going to be in a rowing competition, it makes sense to deplete your carbohydrates in the upper body instead of going out for a run. If you're going to be running a marathon, it makes sense for you to deplete your muscle glycogen by using your legs for a run until volitional fatigue. Then on days 2 to 4, you will ingest a low carbohydrate diet. And then in stage 2 and days 5, 6, and 7, you will slowly increase the amount of carbohydrates in your diet. And at the same time, you're going to taper off your exercise, because it doesn't make sense for you to replenish your carbohydrates and then carry out your same exercise intensity and deplete the carbohydrates that you've just repleted your muscle with. So there is a tapering effect, which may lead to a detraining effect in carbo loading. Then at stage 3 is competition day, and you'd follow or you'd start that day with a high carbohydrate pre-competition meal right before you compete. Sherman's glycogen loading is a little bit different from A-strands, and it states that you do not have to deplete your glycogen through all-out exercise. What Sherman's model says is that you could slowly increase the amount of glycogen or the amount of carbohydrates you ingest, and taper off your exercise regimen. And then by day 5 or 6, you would have the same amount of carbohydrates stored as muscle glycogen in your body. So in red is showing a strands model where you're going to do exhaustive exercise. So your muscle glycogen is going to be reduced. And then you're going to slowly increase your amount of carbohydrate intake through your diet and taper off your exercise regimen. Sherman's glycogen loading protocol says that you do not have to do that exhaustive exercise, but you can just start to increase carbohydrates in your diet and taper off your exercise, and the results would be about the same. So the benefits of carbo loading or glycogen loading is that you'd be able to increase your muscle glycogen by 2 to 3 times, so 200 to 300%. It will increase your endurance capacity and increase your sprinting ability at the end of a prolonged activity. This glycogen loading protocol is not going to be effective or recommended for individuals who have type 2 diabetes, because eating a diet high in carbohydrates goes against the recommendations for type 2 diabetics. Also, if you've ever carbo loaded, you've noticed that your muscles feel stiff and heavy. And this is because with every gram of glycogen, 2.6 grams of water are stored along with it. So it's a heavy feel, and it'll make you feel not very agile and just kind of bloated and stiff. Also, your glycogen loading has a detraining effect because you can't, or you wouldn't want to use all the glycogen that you've already replenished your muscles with. So you're going to take it easy right before competition. This graph is just showing subjects with high carbohydrate diet are able to exercise longer than those on low or normal carbohydrate diets. This graph is showing that muscle glycogen synthesis is slow, and it's going to require several days to restore normal blood glucose. Not normal blood glucose. It's going to require several days to restore normal muscle glycogen following exhaustive exercise. So you can see that glycogen during the event has decreased, and then as a result, glycogen synthase, an enzyme which helps to increase glycogen synthesis, is going to increase, but it takes a little bit of time over the period of the next few days to maximize glycogen storage again. So therefore, it goes to stand that scheduling back-to-back long endurance events is not going to be a good idea from the substrate point of view, where you wouldn't be able to maximize your glycogen storage after a very exhaustive endurance-like race. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this slide. This slide is just showing how to achieve positive protein balance, where on this side it's showing a negative protein balance, and on this side it's showing a positive protein balance. And this is being accomplished with exercise and feeding. So if you recall, there was a slide in a previous chapter which talked about how insulin, exercise, and specifically leucine stimulates the mTOR pathway to stimulate protein synthesis. So there was a study that involved subjects who cycled. And these subjects would cycle unilaterally, so with only one leg, and the other leg would rest. And they did muscle biopsies to look at the amount of protein synthesis that occurred in the muscle. And these subjects ingested either whey, casein, or soy-based protein. And what the study showed was that protein synthesis was maximized in subjects who ingested whey in the exercising muscle. And this is where this graph comes from, where our positive protein balance is going to be maximized when we feed with whey-based protein and combine it with exercise. And the mechanism behind this is because exercise and amino acids, specifically leucine and also insulin, are stimulators of protein synthesis or muscle growth. The next two slides talks about carbohydrate replenishment through sports drinks. So if you've noticed, if you drink Powerade or Gatorade, the carbohydrate component should not be higher than 6%, because if it's higher than 6%, it slows down the gastric emptying and it can cause GI distress and give you an upset stomach. So what this graph is showing is that with higher carbohydrate content, there's a lower rate of gastric emptying. So if you're going to replenish with a sports drink during a long endurance event, pick a drink or pick a replenishment fluid with a 6% or less contribution from carbohydrates. So if you've ever tried the difference between Powerade and Gatorade uses glucose as the carbohydrate. Powerade uses fructose as its carbohydrate. Typically, for most individuals, glucose is going to be kinder to the stomach and not cause so much GI distress, which is probably why most athletes or most people prefer Gatorade over Powerade. When you're designing or when you're going to plan for a long endurance event, you want to make sure that the fluid that you're drinking is supplied in a bottle with a wide mouth. It's cool and palatable. You don't want to be using a bottle where you need to suck to get that fluid out, because it's going to make it harder for you to hydrate and get the carbohydrate replenishment that you need. So this is the end of this section, and I will come back and record a new section for the second and third parts of this video.